The lockdown wasn't scheduled. The bunker wasn't supposed to lock from the inside. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. I had been down there dozens of times before. Routine inspections, system checks. Nothing complicated. The entrance protocol was always the same. Manual access. Internal verification. Then a timed window before the outer door sealed again. Control predictable. Designed to keep things running without trapping anyone inside. That day started no differently. I entered, authenticated, and heard the outer door close behind me with the usual mechanical precision. The sound echoed briefly through the entry corridor, then faded into the low hum of the bunker systems. Air circulation, power distribution, background processes, everything steady, everything normal. I didn't rush. There was no reason to. The system wasn't designed to surprise you. It followed procedure, and as long as you followed it back, nothing went wrong. I moved through the first checkpoint, ran the initial diagnostics, and confirmed what I already expected. Everything operational. Then the second door sealed. Not unusual on its own. Internal doors close automatically to maintain pressure zones and environmental control. But this time, it didn't cycle back open. I paused, waited for the system to correct itself. It didn't. I stepped back to the console and checked the status. No error messages. No alerts. Just a clean interface showing the door as fully secured. Not malfunctioning. Not delayed. Locked. That was the moment the routine broke. I ran a manual override. Nothing. Tried again, slower this time, verifying each input before executing it. The system accepted the command, processed it, and returned a response. Access denied. That had never happened before. I checked my credentials. Still valid. Clearance unchanged. There was no reason for the system to reject me unless something had overridden the normal hierarchy. I moved to the next panel, deeper into the bunker. If one door had failed, the rest should still respond. That's how redundancy works. Independent systems, isolated control points. One failure doesn't cascade. Except this wasn't a failure. The next door sealed before I reached it. No warning. No delay. Just a clean, precise movement as the locking mechanisms engaged. The sound was sharper this time, louder in confined space. Deliberate. I stopped moving. Listened. The hum of the bunker had changed. Not louder, not quieter. Different. A shift in rhythm. Like additional systems had come online. Background processes I hadn't noticed before were now active, layered beneath the usual operations. I turned back toward the entry corridor. The path I had just taken was no longer open. Every door between me and the surface had sealed. That wasn't procedure. There was always a delay, a buffer, time to exit if something triggered internally. The system wasn't designed to trap its operator. It was designed to protect them, unless the priority had changed. I moved quickly now, not running, but faster than before, toward the central control room. If something had overridden local access, it would show there. The interface was already active when I arrived. That was wrong. It should have required manual input. Instead, the screen displayed a status I had never seen before. Containment protocol active. I didn't touch anything at first. Just read. System lockdown. Engaged. External access. Disabled. Internal movement. Restricted. No countdown. No explanation. No event log leading up to it. Just the result. I accessed the logs manually, scrolling back to the last recorded events. There should have been a trigger, a condition, a command, something that initiated the sequence. There wasn't. The protocol had activated without a recorded cause. That meant one of two things. Either the system had detected something it wasn't logging, or the trigger wasn't inside the bunker at all. I checked the external feed. No signal. Not weak. Not interrupted. Gone. The bunker had cut itself off completely. No communication. No data. No way to confirm what was happening above ground. I stood there, staring at the interface, running through every possibility I could justify. System failure didn't fit. The execution was too precise. Manual override didn't fit. I hadn't initiated it, and no one else had access at this level. That left only one option. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do, just not when it was supposed to. I stepped back from the console slowly, the weight of the situation settling into something more concrete. The bunker wasn't malfunctioning. It was responding. And whatever it was responding to, it had already started. The last transmission before silence. The bunker wasn't completely blind. Even in full lockdown, it maintained a passive listening channel. One-way reception, low bandwidth, designed to capture emergency broadcasts without exposing the system to external interference. It wasn't meant for communication, just awareness. I hadn't checked it yet. There was no point before. Routine inspections didn't require external data. But now, with every outbound signal cut and the system running on a protocol I didn't initiate, it was the only connection left. I accessed the receiver manually. At first, there was nothing. Static, low-frequency noise, the kind that fills empty channels when no signal is present. I adjusted the gain, filtered out interference, cycled through known emergency bands. Most were silent. Not inactive, silent. That was different. Inactive channels usually degrade slowly. Intermittent signals, partial transmissions, something to indicate failure. This was clean absence, as if the signals had been removed, not lost. Then one channel responded. Weak but structured. I locked onto it, stabilizing the frequency as best as I could. The signal fluctuated, dipping in and out, but there was enough consistency to extract audio. Repeat, this is not a localized event. The voice was strained, controlled but close to breaking. Not panic, containment. Someone trying to deliver information within constraints. Multiple zones reporting system failure. Do not rely on standard. The transmission cut briefly, replaced by static. I adjusted again, pushing the receiver harder than it was designed for. If you are hearing this, you are already within. Another drop. Not interference this time. Interruption. The signal didn't fade. It stopped, then resumed at a slightly shifted frequency, as if it had been forced to reroute. Avoid contact with. Silence. I waited. Nothing returned. I cycled through adjacent bands, searching for continuity. Sometimes emergency broadcasts repeat across multiple frequencies, overlapping to ensure coverage. There should have been redundancy. There wasn't, just fragments. I replayed what I had captured, isolating each segment, analyzing the gaps between them. Not a localized event. Multiple zones. Do not rely on standard. You are already within. Avoid contact with. Each phrase incomplete, but aligned in direction. This wasn't a warning for something approaching. It was a warning for something already present. The phrasing mattered. Already within. Not approaching. Not spreading. Inside. I checked the timestamp on the signal. No reference. The broadcast carried no time data. No origin marker. It could have been minutes old, or hours. Without external synchronization, there was no way to place it accurately. That uncertainty made it worse, because it meant I couldn't calculate distance or progression. I ran a deeper scan, pushing the receiver into wider ranges, searching for any additional signals, military bands, private channels, anything that might still be active. Nothing. Not even noise from routine traffic. Airwaves don't go quiet unless something forces them to. Either transmission infrastructure had failed across multiple regions, or something had made broadcasting irrelevant. I leaned back from the console, letting the silence settle. The bunker's internal systems continued their steady operation, unaffected by whatever was happening outside. Power stable, airflow controlled, no indication of internal threat. But the external world had changed, not gradually, completely. I returned to the captured audio one more time, focusing on the interruptions. They weren't random. Each cut happened mid-sentence, not at natural pauses. That suggested the transmission wasn't degrading. It was being interrupted deliberately or encountering something that prevented completion. That detail mattered more than the words themselves, because it meant whoever sent that message hadn't finished it. They were stopped. I isolated the final fragment again. Avoid contact with. No object. No subject. Just a directive. Avoid contact with what? People? Surfaces? Air? Without context, The instruction was useless, but the intent was clear. There was something that required distance, and the system I was inside had already enforced it. I shut down the receiver, not because it was useless, but because it had given me everything it could. Fragments, enough to confirm that the lockdown wasn't premature. It was late, and whatever had triggered it had already spread far enough that no one was able to finish explaining it. Realizing I was already trapped inside, the first instinct was control. Override the system, reset the protocol, force the bunker back into manual operation. That's what it was designed for. Fail-safes layer beneath automation, human authority above system response. No lockdown was supposed to be absolute. I went back to the main console. The interface hadn't changed. Containment protocol active. No additional information, no countdown, no indication of duration. Just a static state, as if time inside the system had stopped progressing. I initiated a full override sequence. Not the basic one I had tried earlier. This was deeper. Multi-layer authentication, command chaining, bypassing standard restrictions. The kind of access reserved for system failures or critical intervention. The console accepted the inputs, processed them, then returned the same response. Access denied. No delay, no hesitation, just rejection. I tried again, altering the sequence, introducing variations in command order, forcing different pathways through the system. Each attempt followed the same pattern. Accepted, processed, denied. That wasn't a lockout. That was hierarchy. Something had placed itself above my level of control. I moved to the secondary terminal, isolated from the main interface. If the primary system was compromised, redundancy should allow partial access elsewhere. That was the design. The secondary terminal powered on normally. System status mirrored the main console. No discrepancy. That eliminated internal conflict. Both systems were aligned, which meant the decision to lock down hadn't originated from a single point. It had been executed across the entire network simultaneously. I shifted focus. If I couldn't override the protocol directly, I could try to interrupt it, cut power to specific subsystems, force a reset, trigger a fail-safe response that would reopen access points. Risky, but still within the boundaries of control. I traced the power distribution lines on the console, identifying the segments responsible for door control and environmental regulation. If I disrupted them carefully, I could isolate the locking mechanisms without compromising life support. In theory, I initiated a controlled shutdown of the door systems. The command executed, power rerouted. For a moment, the system flickered, just enough to suggest something had changed. Then the doors remained sealed. The system compensated instantly, rerouting control through a secondary circuit I hadn't accessed. The lockdown held without interruption. That was the moment the realization shifted from possibility to certainty. This wasn't a system I could interrupt. It was one designed to continue without me. I stepped back from the console, letting the implications settle. Every layer I tried to access was already accounted for. Every workaround I attempted had been anticipated. The system wasn't malfunctioning, and it wasn't resisting randomly. It was following a protocol that assumed I would try to stop it. I moved through the bunker again, this time with a different objective. Not to fix anything, to confirm the boundaries. Every door responded the same, sealed, unresponsive to manual input. Every access panel showed restricted status. Even areas that should have remained open under emergency conditions were locked down. There were no gaps, no overlooked pathways, no delays. I reached the entry corridor last. The outer door was visible through the reinforced inner barrier, a solid presence between me and the surface. It hadn't changed physically, but the meaning of it had. Before it was an exit. Now it was a boundary. I approached the inner barrier slowly, not expecting it to open, but needing to see if proximity would trigger any response. Nothing. No movement. No system acknowledgement. Just a barrier, unmoved. I placed my hand against the surface. Cold. Unresponsive. The bunker wasn't waiting for input. It had already made its decision. I returned to the central console one final time. Not to override, but to search for duration, any indication of how long the protocol would remain active. There was none. No timer. No condition for release. No reference to external clearance. Just a sustained state. That was the part that mattered most. Because it meant the system wasn't planning to reopen on its own. Not based on time. Not based on internal conditions. Only on something external. And whatever that condition was, I had no way of knowing when or if it would ever be met. I stood there, looking at the interface, the silence of the bunker pressing in around me. The system was working exactly as designed. Sealed from the outside. Sealed from interference. And completely beyond my control. I wasn't waiting for the door to open anymore. I was waiting for a system that no longer answered to me to decide when I was allowed to leave. And that meant one thing. I wasn't just inside the bunker. I was contained by it. What the bunker was built to do. Once it became clear I couldn't leave, the focus shifted from escape to understanding. The bunker wasn't just a structure. It was a system designed with a specific purpose. And whatever had triggered the lockdown meant it was now operating exactly as intended. If I was going to survive inside it, I needed to understand what it was built to do, not what I assumed it did. I started with layout. The bunker wasn't a single chamber. It was layered. Entry corridor, decontamination zone, operational core, storage sections, and isolated compartments that weren't meant for regular access. Each layer served a function, and each one could be sealed independently. That segmentation wasn't for convenience. It was for control. If something compromised one section, the rest could be isolated instantly. No spread. No cross-contamination. Movement wasn't just restricted. It was managed. The doors reflected that. Reinforced, pressure-sealed. Controlled by the central system. Manual overrides existed, but only within limits. I had already confirmed those limits didn't apply during full protocol activation. The system prioritized containment over accessibility. That was the first contradiction. This place wasn't just built to protect the people inside. It was built to restrict them. I moved to the environmental systems next. Air filtration was more advanced than necessary for standard underground operation. Multi-stage filters, pressure regulation, controlled intake and output channels. The system didn't just circulate air. It filtered, measured, and adjusted it continuously. That level of control suggested something beyond basic safety. It suggested contamination. Not just external, but potentially internal. I checked the airflow logs. Even under lockdown, the system was adjusting intake rates automatically, responding to conditions I couldn't see. That meant it was monitoring something outside the bunker and adapting in real time, which meant the environment above wasn't stable. Water systems were similarly contained. Storage tanks were sealed, isolated from external sources. No direct intake from outside, no reliance on surface infrastructure. Everything was internal, controlled, and finite. That made sense for long-term survival. But it also meant there was no option to replenish without breaking containment. Another contradiction. The bunker could sustain life, but only within limits it couldn't extend. Power followed the same pattern. Primary generators, backup systems, energy distribution mapped across essential zones. Non-critical areas could be shut down automatically to conserve resources. The system wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for prioritization. If power dropped, it would decide what stayed on and what didn't. Not me. Then I reached storage. Food supplies, medical kits, tools. Everything categorized, sealed, and distributed across multiple sections. Not centralized. Not easily accessible all at once. It required movement through controlled zones to gather what I needed. That slowed access, which didn't make sense for convenience. But it did make sense for control. If movement was restricted, access to resources would be restricted with it. Every part of the bunker followed the same logic. Redundancy, isolation, control. Not flexibility. Not freedom. The final system I checked was automation. The bunker wasn't waiting for input to function. It monitored itself, adjusted systems automatically, responded to conditions without requiring human direction. That was why the lockdown had activated without warning. It didn't need me to initiate it. It only needed a trigger. And once that trigger was met, everything shifted. The bunker stopped being a shelter. It became a controlled environment. I stepped back from the systems, looking at the structure differently now. Before, I had seen it as protection, a place designed to keep external threats out while sustaining whoever was inside. Now, the design made more sense. Layered containment, controlled resources, limited movement, autonomous decision-making. This wasn't just a bunker. It was a containment unit, built to isolate something during a biological event, something that could spread, something that required sealed layers, filtered air, and restricted access. And the most important detail wasn't in what it included. It was in what it didn't. There was no system designed to let people leave quickly. No emergency release tied to internal conditions. No priority for evacuation. Because evacuation wasn't the objective. Containment was. And once that protocol activated, the bunker didn't care whether I was protected inside. Only that whatever it was responding to didn't get out. Designing the multi-level layout, the bunker wasn't designed to feel large. It was designed to feel controlled. But once I understood how the layers worked, the layout stopped being restrictive and started becoming usable. Not comfortable, usable. I stopped thinking of it as a single space. It was 3 levels, whether the structure officially labeled them that way or not. Upper control, mid-level habitation, lower storage, and systems. Each one had a purpose, and more importantly, each one could function independently for a limited time. That independence mattered, because if one level failed, I needed the others to hold long enough to react. I started at the top. The upper level wasn't built for living. It was narrow, structured around access points and observation lines. From there, I could monitor key sections of the bunker without moving through them. Corridors, doorways, system panels. Everything visible from controlled angles. That made it the closest thing to a defensive position, not against something outside, against uncertainty inside. If movement occurred where it shouldn't, this was where I would see it first. It gave me distance, perspective, and time to decide how to respond. I reinforced that role mentally. No storage here. No unnecessary equipment. Just access, visibility, and control. The less clutter, the fewer variables. Then I moved to the mid-level. This was where I would spend most of my time. It had the widest space, the most direct access to essential systems, and the least restriction under normal conditions. Living, working, monitoring, it all happened here. But I couldn't leave it open. Open space creates exposure. If something moved through the bunker, it would move through here. I divided it into zones, not physically at first, but functionally. Areas for rest, areas for work, areas for system interaction. Each one separated by purpose, not walls. Movement between them had to be intentional. No drifting. No unnecessary crossing of space. If I moved, it was for a reason. That reduced unpredictability. Then I adjusted access points. Doors that connected sections were no longer just pathways. They became control points. If something needed to be isolated, I needed to know exactly which doors to close and in what order. That sequence had to be clear before I needed it, because under pressure, hesitation creates mistakes. Finally, the lower level. This was the most stable part of the bunker. Isolated, controlled, less exposed to movement or system fluctuations. It housed storage and critical utilities, water, backup supplies, parts of the power system. It wasn't designed for constant access. That was intentional. If I had to go down there, it meant something had changed. Either I was retrieving reserves, or I was responding to a system issue. In both cases, it wasn't routine. That made a fallback zone. If the upper levels became compromised, this was where I could hold position temporarily. Not indefinitely, but long enough to reassess. The problem was access. One primary route, narrow, controlled. If that path was blocked or restricted, the lower level became unreachable. I couldn't change the structure, but I could manage the risk. I kept the path clear at all times. No storage near the entrance. No equipment that could shift or obstruct movement. If I needed to reach it quickly, nothing could slow me down. Then I connected the levels mentally. Each one had a role, but they weren't isolated systems. They depended on each other. Upper level for awareness, mid-level for operation, lower level for sustainability. If one failed, the others had to compensate. That meant distributing critical items carefully. Not everything in one place. Some supplies stayed mid-level for immediate use. Essential backups were stored below. Tools for quick response remained accessible above. It wasn't efficient in terms of movement, but it reduced the risk of losing everything at once. Redundancy over convenience. I tested the layout by moving through it under restrictions. Slower pace. Limited visibility. Controlled breathing. Simulating conditions where stress would affect judgment. It exposed weaknesses quickly. Areas where movement was inefficient. Transitions that took too long. Points where I hesitated. I adjusted those. Simplified paths. Reduced unnecessary crossings. Defined clear routes between levels that didn't overlap or create confusion. By the time I finished, the bunker didn't feel like a confined space anymore. It felt segmented, layered, controlled. Each level had a purpose. Each movement had a cost. Each decision had a place within the structure. And that was the difference. Because survival in a sealed environment isn't about having space. It's about knowing exactly how that space works when you don't have the option to leave. Resource planning and supply runs. The bunker could sustain life, but only within limits it couldn't change. That meant every resource inside had to be treated as finite from the moment the lockdown started. There was no resupply, no adjustment based on new conditions. Whatever existed now had to last. I started with inventory. Not assumptions, not rough estimates. Exact counts. Every food unit. Every liter of water. Every measurable output from the power system. I logged everything manually, cross-checking against system records to confirm accuracy. If there was a discrepancy, I resolved it immediately, because miscalculation would cost more later. Food was the simplest to quantify. Caloric intake defined survival, not variety. I set a baseline at 1,800 calories per day, enough to function without wasting supply. The total reserves gave me a window, but that window depended on discipline. Every increase in consumption shortened it. So I locked it. No deviation unless conditions required it. Water was less flexible. Storage levels were fixed, and while filtration systems existed, they depended on internal reserves. There was no external intake under lockdown. That meant every liter consumed was one I wouldn't get back. I calculated minimum usage. 3 liters per day for basic function. Less if necessary, but reduction came with consequences. Fatigue, reduced efficiency, slower decision-making. I couldn't afford that early, so I balanced it. Enough to maintain clarity, not enough to waste. Power introduced a different kind of constraint. The bunker had multiple energy sources, but none of them were infinite. Primary systems could run for extended periods, but not indefinitely. Backup systems extended that window, but only if used correctly. I mapped consumption against time. Lighting, system operations, environmental controls. Each one had a cost. I reduced non-essential usage immediately. Light stayed off unless required. Systems ran at minimum capacity. Anything that didn't directly support survival was eliminated. It wasn't comfortable, but comfort wasn't the objective. Fuel for auxiliary systems became a secondary concern, not critical at first, but important if primary power degraded. I logged quantities, estimated burn rates, and defined conditions under which I would use it, not before. Because once fuel was gone, it was gone. Tools came next, not just for maintenance, but for adaptation. Systems fail over time. Filters clog. Components degrade. Without the ability to repair, even minor issues could become critical. I organized tools by function, not location. Everything I needed for a specific task stayed together. That reduced time spent searching and minimized movement between zones. Efficiency under pressure mattered more than neat storage. Then I addressed medical supplies. Injury inside a sealed environment isn't just a problem. It's a multiplier. Limited treatment options, no external support, increased resource consumption. I checked everything. Expiration dates, quantities, accessibility. Nothing missing, but nothing replaceable either. That changed how I approached risk. Every action had to account for the possibility of injury, not just failure. If something could go wrong physically, I avoided it unless it was necessary. Then I created usage rules, not suggestions, limits, daily consumption targets, system operation windows. conditioned for increasing or decreasing usage. Everything defined before it became urgent, because decisions made under pressure are rarely optimal. The first tension point appeared quickly, not from shortage, from awareness. Knowing exactly how long something lasts changes how you use it. Every action becomes a calculation. Every decision carries weight beyond the moment. I adjusted to that. Focus on routine instead of projection. If I thought too far ahead, the numbers became restrictive. If I stayed within the current cycle, the system remained manageable. That balance mattered, because survival wasn't just about having resources. It was about using them without letting the knowledge of their limits affect every decision. By the time I finished, nothing inside the bunker was undefined. Every resource had a value. Every value had a limit. And every limit had a consequence. The system was stable, but only if I stayed within the boundaries it imposed. Because once I crossed them, there would be no way to recover what I had lost. The first external noise I couldn't ignore. For the first few cycles, the bunker felt insulated from everything above it. No vibration, no signal bleed, no indication that anything had changed beyond the loss of communication. The systems operated cleanly, the air remained stable, and the structure held its silence like it always had. That silence was expected. What wasn't expected was how it changed. It started as something I almost dismissed. A faint disturbance, barely noticeable beneath the steady hum of the bunker systems. Not a sound in the usual sense, more like a disruption in rhythm. The background noise shifted slightly, as if something above had interrupted the pattern for a fraction of a second. I stopped moving. Listen, nothing. The system returned to normal. I marked the time mentally and continued with routine checks. It could have been structural settling, minor pressure fluctuation, something internal adjusting under load. The bunker was designed to compensate for changes without drawing attention to them. But it happened again. This time clearer. A sharp impact, distant but distinct enough to separate from system noise. It didn't echo the way internal sounds did. It carried differently, through layers of concrete and reinforcement, reduced but not erased. Something had struck the surface above. Not hard enough to compromise structure, but hard enough to register. I moved toward the nearest monitoring station, pulling up structural feedback data. If the impact had any significance, it would show as a deviation, pressure change, vibration spike, something measurable. The readings were stable. No anomaly. That didn't match what I had heard. I waited. The bunker returned to its steady rhythm again, as if nothing had happened. But now that I had noticed a difference, the baseline felt less certain. Every small fluctuation carried weight. Then the third sound came. Not a single impact. Multiple, irregular spacing. No pattern I could immediately define. Not rhythmic, not mechanical. Each one separated by inconsistent intervals, seconds, then longer gaps, then another sequence. Movement. That was the first conclusion that made sense. Not controlled, not structured. Something shifting position above the bunker, creating contact with the surface at unpredictable points. I stayed still, tracking the intervals, trying to build a pattern. There wasn't one. That made it worse. If it had been mechanical, I could define it. If it had been structural, I could trace it. But randomness at that scale suggested something else. Something moving without coordination. I accessed additional sensors. Surface microphones, limited in range but sensitive enough to capture external disturbances under certain conditions. They weren't designed for continuous monitoring, but they could provide fragments. I activated them. Static at first, then a faint signal. Not clear enough to identify, but layered, multiple sources overlapping. Low-frequency noise, intermittent impacts, something dragging or shifting across the surface. I adjusted the filters. The signal sharpened slightly, still indistinct, but present. The bunker hadn't been silent. It had been masking. The systems dampened external noise to maintain internal stability. What I was hearing now was what had managed to push through that suppression, which meant whatever was happening above wasn't minor. It was persistent. I cross-referenced the timing with the earlier broadcast fragments. No direct alignment, but the implication was clear. The external environment wasn't just unstable. It was active. I stepped away from the console, letting the sound continue in the background, not focusing on it directly, but not ignoring it either. Constant attention would distort perception. I needed to recognize changes, not chase them. Then something shifted. One of the impacts came closer. Not physically closer in distance, but sharper in clarity. The transmission through the structure carried more detail, less dampened, more defined. That meant the source had moved. Toward the bunker. I froze. Not out of fear. Out of calculation. If something above was moving in this direction, it wasn't random anymore. It had a path. And that path intersected with my position. I reduced system noise, lowered non-essential operations to minimize interference with the external feed. The bunker quieted slightly, enough to make the next sound stand out more clearly. It came, slower, heavier, not a strike this time. A shift, something moving across the surface, maintaining contact longer than before. The sound dragged, then stopped, paused, then nothing. No follow-up, no continuation, just absence. I waited. Seconds stretched. No new signal. That pause meant something. Movement doesn't stop without reason. Either it had changed direction, or it had reached a point of interest. I looked up, though there was nothing to see. The bunker held its silence again, system steady, environment unchanged. But the difference was no longer external. It was internal, because now I knew the outside world hadn't just collapsed. It had moved close enough to be heard, and whatever was up there was no longer passing by. The air system adjusted without my input. The bunker didn't react to sound. It reacted to conditions. That's what made the next change harder to ignore. I wasn't near the console when it happened. I was moving to the mid-level, following the routine I had set, checking supply zones, confirming access points, maintaining consistency. The environment had been stable for hours. Temperature constant, airflow steady. Then the air shifted, not dramatically, not enough to trigger an immediate alarm, but noticeable. The flow changed direction slightly, pressure adjusting in a way that didn't match the baseline I had already memorized. I stopped, waited. Sometimes the system recalibrated on its own. Minor fluctuations corrected within seconds. That was normal. This didn't correct. It stabilized. I moved to the nearest environmental panel and pulled up the airflow data. The system had already updated. Intake reduced. Filtration cycle increased. Internal circulation rerouted. None of it matched my inputs. I hadn't initiated any changes. I checked for manual overrides. Nothing. No command logs. No user interaction. No indication that the system had received instruction from within the bunker. That left only one possibility. It had responded to something outside. I accessed the external sensor data, linked to the air system. Limited information, but enough to show variation in intake conditions. Particulate density, pressure differences, minor chemical fluctuations. The readings weren't extreme, but they weren't normal. The system had detected something in the external air supply and adjusted before I even noticed. That was the design. Automatic response to contamination risk. But the threshold for that response wasn't low. Whatever detected had crossed a defined boundary. I checked the filtration status. Primary filters engaged. Secondary filters activated. The system had escalated without prompting. That meant it wasn't treating this as a minor anomaly. It was treating it as a developing condition. I stood there, watching the data update in real time. Airflow patterns shifted again, not randomly, but with purpose. The system was redistributing internal circulation, compensating for reduced intake, maintaining pressure balance while limiting exposure. Efficient, controlled, and completely outside my control. I attempted a manual adjustment, not override, just a test response. The system accepted the input, processed it, then returned to its own configuration within seconds. It wasn't rejecting commands. It was prioritizing its own. That confirmed hierarchy again. During containment protocol, environmental control didn't belong to me. It belonged to the system. I moved through the bunker, tracking the effect physically. The difference was subtle, but consistent. Air felt denser in certain zones, lighter in others. Circulation paths had changed, redirecting flow through areas I hadn't prioritized before. That meant the system wasn't just reducing intake. It was optimizing internal conditions based on new variables. Variables I couldn't fully see. I returned to the main console and pulled deeper logs. The system had flagged a change under environmental variance. No specifics. No explanation. Just a recorded shift and an automatic response. That lack of detail mattered, because it meant the system wasn't designed to inform. It was designed to act. I cross-referenced the timing with the external noise I had heard earlier. They aligned. The first significant airflow adjustment occurred shortly after the initial series of impacts above the bunker. Not immediately, but close enough to suggest correlation. Movement outside. Environmental change. System response. The sequence was too precise to ignore. I reduced my own activity. Lower oxygen consumption. Less movement between zones. If the system was compensating for reduced intake, I needed to support that balance, not disrupt it. Then I watched. Not for another adjustment, but for escalation. If the external condition worsened, the system would respond again. Increase filtration, reduce intake further, possibly isolate certain zones. That was a risk, because each adjustment tightened the system. Reduce flexibility. Reduce margin. I checked the thresholds. Not accessible. The parameters that controlled these changes were locked behind the same protocol that had sealed the bunker. I could see the result, but not the limits. That meant I couldn't predict the next shift, only react to it. The air continued moving through the bunker, steady but altered, controlled, filtered, restricted. And for the first time since the lockdown began, I understood something clearly. The bunker wasn't just sealed to keep me safe. It was actively adjusting to something outside that was changing faster than I could track. And whatever that change was, the system had already decided it couldn't be ignored. The rules that would keep me alive, the bunker could sustain life, but it wouldn't manage it for me. That responsibility didn't belong to the system. It belonged to discipline. Without it, everything I had, air, water, power, time, would degrade faster than I could recover. The difference between survival and failure wouldn't be the structure. It would be behavior. So I set the rules before pressure could change them. The first was movement. No unnecessary movement between levels. Every transition carried cost. Air displacement, energy use, exposure to system shifts I didn't fully control. If I moved, it had to serve a purpose. No wandering. No checking things twice just to feel certain. Certainty didn't justify risk. The second was access. No forced entry into restricted zones. The system had already shown it would override my authority. If it sealed an area, there was a reason, even if I didn't know what it was. Trying to bypass that without full understanding could create a problem I wouldn't be able to contain. So if a door stayed closed, it stayed closed. The third rule was consumption. Every resource had a limit, and that limit had to be respected before it became critical. Food intake stayed fixed. Water usage tracked precisely. Power used only when necessary. Not reduced to the point of weakness, but never allowed to drift upward, because drift becomes loss. I logged everything. Not mentally, physically. Daily records. Intake, output, system usage. If something changed, I needed to see it immediately, not after it had already affected the system. The fourth rule was noise. Sound carried differently in the bunker, especially now that the air system had adjusted. Every impact, every misplaced step, every drop tool had the potential to travel through the structure in ways I couldn't fully predict. So I controlled it. Slow movement, intentional placement, no unnecessary force. If something made noise, it had to be for a reason. The fifth rule was routine. Not comfort-based routine, but operational consistency. Systems checked at the same intervals. Supplies verified on a fixed schedule. Movement patterns defined and repeated. Routine creates baseline. Baseline reveals change. If something shifted, even slightly, I would notice. The sixth rule was isolation. No external contact. Not that I had the option anymore, but the rules still mattered. If the bunker reopened or external access became possible, I wouldn't assume safety. The broadcast had made that clear. Do not rely on standard. Already within. Avoid contact with. Incomplete, but enough. Whatever was outside wasn't something I could interact with safely. So the rule stood. No contact. The seventh rule was assumption. Assume the system is correct. Not because it was perfect, but because it had more information than I did. It was reacting to variables I couldn't see. Environmental changes, external conditions, internal thresholds. If it adjusted airflow, there was a reason. If it restricted access, there was a reason. I didn't need to understand it immediately. I needed to work within it. The final rule was the most important. Assume failure. Not as fear, but as expectation. Every system would degrade. Every plan would reach its limit. Every assumption could be wrong. If I treated stability as permanent, I would miss the moment it started to break. So I didn't. I treated everything as temporary. Airflow stable for now. Power sufficient for now. Resources adequate for now. That mindset forced attention. Constant, controlled attention. I tested the rules against real conditions. Restricted myself deliberately. Limited movement. Reduced consumption. Followed the structure I had created without exception. It wasn't comfortable, but it was consistent. Consistency mattered more than comfort. Because once pressure increased, and it would, the rules wouldn't change. Only the consequences of breaking them would. By the time I finished, the bunker felt different, not safer, more controlled. Every action had weight. Every decision had boundaries. Every movement existed within a system I understood just enough to follow. That was enough. Because survival in a sealed environment doesn't depend on strength. It depends on discipline that doesn't break when everything else starts to. The first sign I was right. The confirmation didn't arrive as a single event. It came in fragments. Just enough to remove doubt, not enough to explain what was happening. I returned to the receiver during a scheduled check, not expecting anything different. The last transmission had cut off mid-sentence, leaving more questions than answers. There was no reason to assume anything new would come through, but the signal was there, weak, distorted, but active. I locked onto it immediately, stabilizing frequency as best as I could. The audio was broken, overlapping with static and interference. But there were words beneath it. Containment failure confirmed, repeat, containment. The signal shifted, dropping for a second before returning. Multiple zones not responding. Do not attempt. Then silence again. I adjusted the receiver, scanning for adjacent frequencies, trying to catch the continuation. Emergency systems usually repeat transmissions, cycling through messages to ensure coverage. This one didn't repeat. It fragmented. I replayed what I had captured, isolating each segment. Containment failure. Multiple zones. Not responding. Do not attempt. The pattern was consistent with the previous transmission. Incomplete. Interrupted. Whoever was sending these messages wasn't finishing them. They were being stopped. I checked the signal strength. Fluctuating, but not degrading in a natural way. It didn't fade gradually. It dropped abruptly, then returned at slightly different frequencies, as if it was being forced to reroute around something. That meant the infrastructure was still partially intact, but unstable. I widened the scan. More channels responded this time. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to confirm activity across multiple bands. Fragment of audio overlapped. Different voices, different locations, all carrying the same underlying tone. Controlled urgency. Stay inside, repeat. No longer secure. If you are hearing this, each message cut before completion. No conclusions. No instructions that could be followed. Just pieces of something larger that never reached full transmission. Then the background noise changed. It wasn't just static anymore. There were sounds beneath it. Distant, distorted, but recognizable. Not mechanical. Not environmental. Irregular. Movement. Shouting, maybe. Hard to tell through the interference. Something chaotic. I increased the gain slightly, pushing the receiver beyond its normal threshold. The signal sharpened just enough to separate layers. They're inside. The voice cut off instantly. Not faded. Cut. I froze. That phrase aligned too closely with the earlier fragment. You are already within. Containment failure. They're inside. The context was incomplete, but the direction was clear. Whatever had triggered the lockdown hadn't been contained. It had spread, and the system I was inside had responded to that spread before it became visible through standard channels. I checked the internal systems again. No change. Airflow controlled. Pressure stable. No alerts. The bunker remained isolated from everything I was hearing. That contrast was sharp. Outside, fragmentation, interruption, collapse. Inside, order. But the order didn't feel reassuring anymore. It felt intentional, like the system had separated itself from something it knew it couldn't control. I stepped away from the receiver, letting the static continue in the background. The fragments kept coming, overlapping, breaking, reforming across different frequencies. None of them complete, none of them stable. Just enough to confirm that whatever had started outside wasn't localized. It wasn't slowing down, and it wasn't being managed. I shut the receiver off, not because I didn't need it, because it wasn't giving me anything new. The pattern was already clear. The lockdown hadn't been premature. It hadn't been cautious. It had been late. The system had activated after containment failed, not before. And that meant the bunker wasn't protecting me from something approaching. It was isolating me from something that was already everywhere else. I stood there for a moment, letting that settle. Every assumption I had made about timing, about distance, about progression, none of it mattered anymore, because the event I had been preparing for was no longer something in the future. It had already happened, and I was only now starting to understand how far it had gone. The system under real pressure. Up to that point, everything had worked exactly as planned. Not perfectly, but predictably. The bunker responded to changes. The systems adjusted, and my rules held the structure together. Even with the fragment of information coming through the receiver, the environment inside remained controlled. That control didn't last. The first strain wasn't structural. It was behavioral. I noticed it in my own movement before anything else. Small changes, moving faster between zones, checking systems more frequently than necessary, repeating actions that had already been confirmed. None of it critical on its own, but it added up. More movement meant more air displacement. More checks meant more power usage. More activity meant more noise. The system hadn't changed. I corrected it immediately. Reduced movement to defined intervals. Eliminated duplicate checks. Forced myself back into routine instead of reaction. That stabilized things, but exposed something I hadn't accounted for. Stress alters efficiency, and inefficiency affects resources. I checked the logs. Power consumption had increased slightly. Not enough to trigger alerts, but enough to shift projections. Water usage had drifted upward. Again, minor, but measurable. Those changes mattered, because they weren't caused by system failure. They were caused by me. I adjusted consumption, reduced power cycles further, limited water use within safe margins, slowed everything down until the numbers aligned again. The system stabilized, but the margin narrowed. Then came the second strain. Noise. The bunker had always carried sound differently, but under reduced airflow and altered system conditions, the acoustics shifted. Internal noise traveled farther, lingered longer. Small impacts echoed in ways they hadn't before. I tested it, dropped the tool from a controlled height. The sound carried farther than expected, not just within the room, but through adjacent sections. That meant one thing. Anything I did inside the bunker was no longer contained to the space I was in. That changed behavior again. Movement slowed further. Every action became deliberate. No unnecessary force. No uncontrolled sound. Because now, noise wasn't just a byproduct. It was exposure. Then came the third strain. Unexpected variables. I noticed it during a routine pass through a low-traffic section, one I hadn't accessed since the lockdown began. Nothing significant had changed at first glance. No structural damage, no system alerts. But something was off. A container had shifted position. Not far, not enough to trigger a system response. But it wasn't where I had left it. I stopped, reconstructed the last time I had been there. No reason to move it. No recorded activity in that zone, which meant either I had made an error earlier or something had changed without my input. I didn't react immediately. Observation first. I checked surrounding areas. No additional movement. No signs of disturbance. Everything else remained consistent. That made it worse, because it isolated the change instead of explaining it. I marked the position mentally and left it untouched. If something had caused it, I needed to see if it happened again. Then I reviewed system logs. No record of movement. No indication that the bunker had adjusted anything in that area, which meant the system hadn't caused it. That left only two possibilities: error or influence. Neither could be confirmed. Both had to be considered. I adjusted my behavior again. Reduced time spent in non-essential zones. Increased reliance on observation from control positions. If something was changing, I needed to detect it without introducing new variables. Then the final strain appeared. Time, not in the sense of duration, but perception. Without external reference, without natural light, without consistent signals. Time inside the bunker became defined only by routine. If routine broke, time lost structure. That affected decision-making, made delays feel shorter, made actions feel more urgent. I corrected for that too. Strict scheduling, fixed intervals, no deviation unless necessary, because losing track of time meant losing control over everything else. By the end of the cycle, nothing had failed, but everything required more effort to maintain. The system still worked, but it wasn't holding itself anymore. It needed constant correction, constant awareness, constant discipline, and that was the real pressure. Not collapse, sustainment, because the bunker wasn't designed to run effortlessly. It was designed to function under control. And if that control slipped, even slightly, the system wouldn't fail all at once. It would drift, slowly, quietly, until something small became something I couldn't correct. Something outside started watching the warehouse. The bunker wasn't supposed to feel exposed. That was the entire point of its design. Sealed layers, controlled intake, no direct visibility to the outside. It separated me from everything above, physically and psychologically. As long as I stayed within its structure, the outside world remained abstract. That changed when the pattern started. I didn't see anything at first. I heard it, not the same irregular impacts from before. Those had been chaotic, scattered, difficult to interpret. This was different, structured, a sequence of faint disturbances above the bunker, spaced at intervals that felt intentional. Not rhythmic, but consistent enough to suggest repetition. Movement that returned to the same area more than once. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The first set passed quickly. 3 distinct contacts, then silence. I waited. Nothing. Then minutes later, it happened again. Same general position. Same spacing. That was the difference. Random movement doesn't return like that. I moved to the sensor panel and activated the surface microphones again, this time focusing on directional filtering. I narrowed the range, isolating the area directly above the bunker's central structure. The signal came through faintly, distorted, but consistent. Contact, pause, shift, contact again. Something was moving with intent. I didn't adjust the gain further. Clarity wasn't the priority. Pattern was. I tracked the timing. The intervals weren't fixed, but they weren't random either. Each sequence followed a similar structure. Approach, pause, reposition, withdraw. Then a gap before the next cycle. It resembled observation. That conclusion didn't sit well, because observation implies awareness. I checked the perimeter sensors tied to external access points. No breach. No direct contact with entry structures. Whatever was above hadn't tried to enter. It had stayed outside. That ruled out immediate threat, but it introduced a different one. If it wasn't trying to get in, why stay? I replayed the audio fragments again, focusing on subtle changes. The second cycle was closer, not significantly, but enough to alter the transmission quality. The contacts were sharper, less dampened by distance. The movement had shifted inward, toward the bunker. I reduced internal noise again, shutting down non-essential systems to improve signal clarity. The bunker quieted, leaving only the filter external feed and the low hum of critical operations. Then I waited. The next sequence came faster. No long gap this time. Contact. Pause. Longer than before. then a slow movement across the surface, dragging, not stepping. The sound maintained contact instead of breaking between impacts. That wasn't consistent with earlier movement. It had changed. I held position, not moving, not adjusting anything that could interfere. Then the sound stopped, not gradually, immediately. No follow-up, no retreat, just absence. That absence carried weight, because movement doesn't stop without reason. Either it had left the area, or it had reached a position where movement was no longer necessary. I checked the sensors again. Still no breach. No direct interaction with the bunker's structure, which meant whatever had been moving above wasn't trying to enter. It was staying close. I leaned back from the console, letting the implications settle. There were only a few possibilities. Survivors. Unlikely. Survivors move with purpose. Searching, signaling, trying to access shelter. They don't repeat patterns without attempting contact. Infected. Possible. But the earlier movement hadn't been erratic enough. It lacked the unpredictability I would expect from something without control. Something else. That category had too many unknowns. I returned to the audio feed one more time. Played the last sequence again. The pause. The shift. The stillness. It didn't feel like random presence. It felt like positioning. I shut the feed down slowly. Not because I had enough information. Because I had enough to understand the direction. Whatever was outside had moved from passing by to staying near, from random movement to repeated patterns, and now from movement to stillness. That progression mattered because it suggested awareness, not just of the environment, but of the structure beneath it. I looked up instinctively, even though there was nothing to see. The bunker remained sealed, unchanged, controlled. But the outside had changed, and whatever was up there was no longer just part of the environment. It had started acting like it knew something was here. And that meant the system wasn't just containing me from the outside anymore. It might be hiding me from something that had already found the exact place to look. The weak point I ignored. I didn't miss the flaw because it was hidden. I missed it because it didn't feel urgent. Every system I built inside the bunker had been designed around control, movement, resources, noise, behavior. I had mapped everything that depended on my decisions. What I didn't fully account for were the parts of the system that didn't. The ventilation path was one of those. I had reviewed it early. Intake filters, pressure regulation, airflow distribution, all checked out. The system was advanced enough to manage environmental changes automatically, and I had already seen it adjust without input. That gave me confidence. Too much. Because confidence shifts attention. And attention defines what you consider a risk. The intake wasn't directly exposed, but it wasn't unreachable either. It relied on external air being available, uncontaminated, and uninterrupted. The system could filter and regulate, but it couldn't create air on its own. That dependency mattered more than I had treated it. The first sign was subtle. Airflow didn't stop. It changed. The difference was small enough that I almost dismissed it as another automatic adjustment. The system had already modified intake once, reacting to whatever was outside. This felt similar, but it didn't stabilize the same way. The flow became slightly restricted, then held at that reduced level instead of correcting. I moved to the environmental panel and checked the data. Intake efficiency had dropped, not critically, but measurably. The system compensated by increasing internal circulation, maintaining pressure and distribution. On the surface, everything still worked. Underneath, something had shifted. I traced the system internally first. Filters were clean. No blockage in the internal channels. No system error, which left only one point of change. The intake itself. I didn't move toward it immediately. Exposure risk was already a factor, and the pattern above the bunker hadn't resolved. If something was interacting with the structure externally, approaching the intake without understanding the situation would create more problems than it solved. So I observed, monitored the change over time. If it was environmental, it would fluctuate. If it was structural, it would degrade. If it was external interference, it would hold. It held. The restrictions stayed consistent, neither worsening nor improving. That stability confirmed something I didn't want to accept. The airflow hadn't been disrupted. It had been adjusted. From the outside, I ran through the implications slowly. If the intake had been reached, the bunker's outer layer had already been navigated. Not breached, but accessed a level I hadn't detected through sensors. That meant one of two things. Either the sensors weren't covering everything, or whatever was outside had found a path I hadn't considered. Neither option worked in my favor. I checked the logs again. No recorded breach. No alert tied to the intake. The system hadn't treated this as an intrusion, which meant it hadn't crossed a defined threshold. That was worse, because it meant the interaction had stayed within parameters the system considered acceptable. I adjusted internally, reduced oxygen demand, limited movement further, slowed activity across all levels to compensate for reduced intake. The system stabilized again, but the margin tightened. That wasn't a fix. It was a delay. I considered reinforcing the intake from inside, not fully sealing it, but adding an internal barrier to prevent further restriction. But that came with its own risk. Reduce intake too much, and the system would start compensating aggressively, potentially isolating sections or limiting airflow further. Every adjustment carried consequences, and I didn't fully understand the external variable I was reacting to. That was the real problem, not the restriction itself, the lack of information behind it. I went back to the surface audio logs, replayed the last sequence, the movement, the pause, the stillness, then the airflow change, the timing aligned, too closely to ignore. Whatever had been above the bunker hadn't just been moving. It had interacted with something. And the intake was the only external system vulnerable enough to allow that interaction without triggering a full alert. That was the weak point. Not because it was fragile, because it depended on something outside remaining stable. And stability no longer existed. I stepped back from the console, letting the system continue its adjusted operation. Everything still worked, but not the way it had before. The bunker was compensating, adapting, holding. But now I understood something I hadn't before. The system wasn't fully sealed. It couldn't be. It depended on the outside, even as it tried to isolate from it. And that meant the outside didn't need to break in. It only needed to find the parts that were already connected. The intake had been one of them. And if that had been found, then whatever was outside wasn't just moving randomly anymore. It was testing. And the next weakness it found wouldn't be one I could afford to ignore. The decision that changed everything. By the time the airflow stabilized at a reduced level, the situation had already shifted, not into failure, into control. Just not mine. The bunker still functioned, but was no longer isolated in the way I had assumed. Something outside had found a point of interaction and used it without forcing a direct breach. That changed the rules. I had two options: stay inside and adapt, or act and risk exposure. The first option was consistent with everything I had built: maintain isolation, reduce consumption further, let the system continue compensating while I stayed within its limits. It would hold, at least for a time. The bunker was designed to sustain under pressure, but that path meant accepting the current condition, accepting that something outside could influence the system without resistance. That wasn't stability. That was dependency. The second option was unpredictable. Intervene, move toward the intake system, reinforce it internally, possibly trace the external access point if the structure allowed it. It would mean approaching the only confirmed vulnerability, exposing myself to whatever had already interacted with it. That carried risk, not just physical, informational. If something outside was observing patterns, responding to system changes, then any action I took could reveal more than just my position. It could reveal behavior, and behavior is something that can be used. I didn't move immediately. I mapped outcomes first. If I stayed inside, the system would continue operating under restriction. Airflow reduced, but stable. Resources consumed at a controlled rate. Time extended, but not indefinitely. If I acted, I could restore airflow, remove the current pressure point. But I might trigger the next one. Both paths led to escalation. The difference was control. One delayed it. The other confronted it. I moved to the upper level and stopped halfway through the access corridor, not to observe directly, But to listen, the surface audio system was still active, quiet, no immediate movement. That silence wasn't reassuring. It was incomplete, because the pattern had already shown that absence didn't mean nothing was there. It meant it wasn't moving. I returned to console and reviewed the airflow data again. The restriction hadn't changed. No further reduction. No escalation. Just sustained pressure. That confirmed intent. Whatever had altered the intake wasn't trying to break the system. It was testing it, applying pressure and waiting. That waiting mattered, because it meant I wasn't the only one evaluating options. I checked the resource projections again. At reduced airflow, the system would hold within safe limits for a defined period, not indefinitely, but long enough that immediate action wasn't required. That removed urgency, which made the decision clearer. Acting without urgency creates unnecessary risk, but waiting too long creates irreversible consequences. The balance was narrow. I moved to the intake control interface, not to override it, to define a response window. If airflow dropped further, I would act. If it held, I would continue observing. That was the plan. Controlled, conditional, then the system changed. Not the intake, not the airflow, the access control. A section of the bunker I had interacted with since the lockdown began. One of the outer maintenance corridors shifted status from sealed to conditional access. I stared at the interface. That wasn't part of the pattern. The system hadn't opened anything since the protocol activated. Not once. I checked the logs. No manual input. No internal trigger. The change had come from the system itself. I pulled up the corridor map. That path led closer to the external structure, closer to the intake, closer to the only confirmed point of interaction. The system had created a route. Not fully open, but available. That changed the equation entirely. This wasn't just about deciding whether to act. The system was giving me the option, which meant one of two things. Either it required intervention, or it was guiding me toward something. I didn't move right away. I looked at the interface, the corridor status, the airflow data, the silence from above. Every variable aligned around one point. The intake, the weak point, the only place where the inside and outside had already connected. If I stayed, I kept control of the environment. If I moved, I risked losing it. But if I ignored the system's change, I might miss the only chance to understand what was happening. I stepped back from the console, letting the decision settle into something solid. This wasn't about restoring airflow anymore. It was about control. Who had it, and whether I still did. Because the moment the system changed without my input, the bunker stopped being just a place I was trapped in. It became something that was actively shaping what I would do next. And whatever waited beyond that corridor was now part of the system I had no choice but to enter. What the warehouse was really designed for. The corridor didn't lead to the intake. It led past it. The system guided me forward, deeper into a section I hadn't accessed before. Sealed, undocumented, absent from the original layout. That alone was enough to stop me. But I kept moving. At the end of the corridor, another door waited. Not reinforced like the others. Not marked. Just there. Unlocked. I opened it slowly. Inside, the space was empty. No supplies. No equipment. Just a sealed chamber with observation panels facing inward, not outward. Designed to watch what was inside, not what was outside. Containment, not protection. The bunker hadn't sealed to keep something out. It had sealed to keep something in. And the system hadn't been responding to the outside. It had been responding to me.